following sermon was delivered at the 10:30 worship service at the United Methodist Church of Kent. Please enjoy.
Well, today is now week 4 in our 5-week worship series, our campaign for compassion, as we've been refocusing on and recommitting to Jesus' golden rule, to do unto others as we would have them do unto us. That golden rule appears twice in our Gospels, in both Matthew and in Luke, each time as part of an extended section of teaching. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus expands upon this golden rule by emphasizing that do unto others means all others, not just those who treat us well. The golden rule is a universal rule for our relationships with all other creatures, not just with our families or friends, not just those who are part of our political or religious or national or ideological tribe. But if you love those who love you, Jesus says, or if you do good to those who do good to you, or if you lend to those who can repay you, what good is that? That's not doing unto others, taking the initiative to build a better world. That's just doing what we already do. But the good news of Jesus isn't to keep doing what we're already doing. The good news of Jesus is to live more fully. It's to love more fully. It's to realize God's loving dream for this world. And so instead, Jesus says, love your enemies. Do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. That's what it means to live as God's beloved children. For God, Jesus says, is kind to ungrateful and wicked people. So we must be compassionate, just as our loving God is compassionate. And so compassion is where we're turning our attention on this day. After focusing during the past 3 weeks on justice and kindness and humility, now we move to compassion. And we do so through this story that Jesus tells just a bit later in this same Gospel of Luke. Although 3 chapters separate Jesus' teaching about the golden rule from today's story, this story really, I think, in many ways serves as an illustration of doing unto others. Jesus tells it in response to a legal expert's questions. First, the legal expert asks, "What must I do to gain eternal life? Tell me about this fuller way of living." Jesus turns the question back to the one who asked it, and he responds by quoting from their shared religious tradition, from Deuteronomy and from Leviticus. "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, with all your strength, with all your might, and love your neighbor as yourself." Jesus affirms that summary, but then the legal expert seeks a clarification. "Who is my neighbor?" he asks. Presumably, he's looking for a definition of who a neighbor is so that he can find a loophole within that definition, so he can limit his love, choose whom and when he will love and whom and when he won't. Perhaps suspecting this, Jesus doesn't give a definition, but instead tells this familiar and challenging story that both expands our understanding of neighbor and illustrates the power of compassion. A person is stripped, beaten, left for dead. Their need is obvious, seemingly unavoidable. And yet the first 2 people who come near do avoid them. They perceive the injured person, but then walk away. The third person, however, is moved with compassion, we're told, and that compassion moves them to respond. They go to the person, bandage their wounds, take them to an inn, and continue to offer ongoing care. Which of these 3 was a neighbor, Jesus asks. The one who demonstrated mercy, the legal expert replies. The one who practiced kindness, mercy, steadfast love. The one who didn't notice their need and then stay away, but the one who was moved with compassion. The one whose compassion moved them to come near and offer care. Throughout our scriptures, that's what compassion always does. Compassion moves people from here to there. Over and over in the Gospels, Jesus himself is on his way somewhere, like the priest, like the Levite, like the Samaritan. He isn't looking for someone to help, and yet along the way, when he notices someone, often he asks what they need, and we are told that he is moved with compassion to act. Compassion moves Jesus to take a detour in his day, to show up and respond to others' needs along the way. And so it does with us, because that's compassion's power. Compassion moves us. Compassion interrupts us, interrupts our self-centeredness and the plans that we make for ourselves. Compassion moves us toward others. Social researcher and author Brené Brown defines compassion as a daily practice of recognizing and accepting our shared humanity so that we treat ourselves and others with loving kindness, and we take action in the face of suffering. Compassion isn't only feeling. Compassion is doing, like the Samaritan, like Jesus, like God, being physically moved. Compassion begins where we were last week, in our posture of humility, affirming our shared humanity. Compassion begins with that basic affirmation that I am human and you are too. We're made of the same stuff, created out of love. We each experience both strength and struggle. None of us is immune to loss or suffering or pain. Compassion, then, is our habit of solidarity, based in the shared beauty and struggle of being human. Compassion is born and embodied on common ground. It is not hierarchical. It is a relationship among equals. Otherwise, our compassion turns into mere pity, and none of us likes to feel that we're being pitied. Pity feels isolating for us because it is. Pity keeps the other person at a distance from ourselves, as an object to be helped or fixed instead of a person to be accompanied. Perhaps the priest and the Levite in the story pitied the injured person. Oh, that poor person, we say when we're feeling pity. I feel sorry for people like that. But notice what's happening when we say or think that. We are perceiving the person that we pity as different from ourselves. We're setting a separation between them and us, holding their suffering at a distance from ourselves in a way that can even feel gratifying for ourselves. Sometimes we even utilize this feeling of pity as a motivator for counting our blessings, reminding ourselves that no matter how bad it might get for us, at least we're not as bad off as they are. Pity doesn't move us then. Pity keeps us where we are, gives us permission to remain comfortably at a distance from others' pain. Compassion, on the other hand, moves us to recognize others' suffering as a reflection of our own, a shared and uniting rather than a separating thing. Compassion means literally to suffer with. It moves us to be with others in their suffering. It doesn't mean that we immerse ourselves in others' suffering to the point of exhaustion or anguish, but rather compassion is our practice of staying open, of being ready to respond, to connect through pain without despair or resentment or aversion. Compassion is our desire to dissipate suffering, our courage to embrace those experiencing sorrow, while eliminating judgment from our minds. Cultivating such compassion that moves us closer, that pulls us out of ourselves so we can accompany another, is essential for healing ourselves and the world, both compassion toward others and even compassion toward ourselves. Recall that the second part of the legal expert summary is to love our neighbors as ourselves. Because the truth is, it's hard to love our neighbors when we don't love ourselves. It's hard to offer kindness to others if we don't offer kindness to ourselves. If we are angry or judgmental or hard on ourselves, we're unlikely to be gentle or caring toward others. So we need to cultivate compassion both toward our neighbors and toward ourselves. Self-compassion isn't easy, though. For so much of our lives is focused on climbing the ladder and trying to get ahead while we're feeling like we're falling behind. Especially as we're starting out in life, trying to get the right grades or land the right internship or complete the right number of service hours or pick and be picked by the right school. That's why so many students and teachers and parents report feeling stressed and overwhelmed these days. There's so many expectations. And it continues then on throughout our lives. That pressure to excel, that expectation not just to be okay, but to achieve and to do so exceptionally. Anything else can feel like failure. And so expecting always to have more and to do more and to be more, and comparing what we are and have done and have to images of folks around us, we become discouraged and self-critical. We judge ourselves for not meeting expectations, others and ours. And that self-judgment manifests as judgment of others. Our lack of self-compassion as a lack of compassion for each other. And so this morning, I want to invite us to consider Jesus' story today as a prayer practice that can help us to cultivate compassion. Compassion both toward others and toward ourselves. You can begin with either one as you practice it, yourself or others, but use your prayerful imagination. For example, as you read or recall this familiar story, imagine that anxious, exhausted, or angry part of yourself as the injured one on the side of the road. How did you get there? What are you feeling? And then imagine your overachieving, over-functioning self as the priest or the Levite passing by. Where are you headed? What must you do that's so important that you can't pause and notice where you're hurting? And when you do finally pause to consider your hurts or your perceived failures or limitations or shortcomings, what is it about them that makes you want to stay away? Who told you in your life that you were supposed to be perfect? And why did you believe them? Finally, then, imagine your compassionate self, your open, loving, kind self, noticing your wounded self, your anxious, tired, angry self, and instead of walking by, moving toward. What support can you give yourself? What words of comfort or care? What mercy can you offer? But be aware as you do this that self-compassion is not self-indulgence. Self-indulgence is a short-term escape from our hard feelings, using entertainment or busyness or habits to distract us, to help us feel better in the moment. Self-compassion is much more than that. Self-compassion is cultivating joy and wholeness for the long term, being present with our whole selves, including our hard feelings and our perceived failures, instead of walking by. Doing so can feel uncomfortable in the short term, but it's the only path to healing down the line. And then you can follow the same pattern of prayerful imagination to cultivate compassion toward others, again considering Jesus' story. Imagine, for example, the people around you, folks you encounter every day or once in a while, maybe folks at work or at school, or while running errands or walking through the neighborhood, maybe family members or friends or strangers, maybe even folks who feel like opponents or enemies these days. Imagine the pain that they might be experiencing in their lives, whether loss or loneliness or physical or emotional brokenness, the pain of self-judgment or unmet expectations. The truth is, we all experience suffering. It's part of being human. We all make mistakes. We all bump up against limitations. We all feel frustrated as we fall short of our ideals. So imagine the hurt of folks around you, whether you know the details or not. And then imagine yourself moving toward them instead of passing by. Begin by shifting your thoughts and then your feelings, desiring earnestly their well-being. And then if it's someone near you, imagine ways that you can physically move, that you can come alongside and join them where they are. What support can you offer? What kindness or care? How is God calling you to move toward instead of walking by? By grace, I hope that you might try this, especially in these coming weeks. There are copies of a guide available on the table in the atrium today. You can take one home. You can share it with someone. On the front, you'll find the story that Jesus tells. On the back, some questions for prayerful consideration. You can begin or end the day with this sort of a prayer practice, imaginatively entering the story that Jesus tells, opening to compassion for others and for yourself. And as you do so, trust that whatever you're feeling these days, as you become more aware of those feelings, however anxious or overwhelmed or inadequate or whatever else, trust that God always is moving toward you, that God never walks away. You are loved, and you are capable of love, even loving yourself, even loving your enemies. For that, thanks be to God. Amen.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the United Methodist Church of Kent Sermon Podcast. For more information about the church, visit www.kentmethodist.org.